Bavaria, May 1945. The war had ended 3 days earlier, but in the village of Oberkirchen, time felt suspended between catastrophe and whatever came next. Smoke still rose from distant cities. Bodies still lay where they had fallen. And in the cellar of what had been the mayor's house, 11 German women huddled with their children, waiting for the victors to arrive. They had been told what to expect: violence, starvation, revenge for 6 years of war. When the American soldiers finally appeared in the cellar entrance, silhouetted against afternoon light, they carried something the women couldn't comprehend: boxes of food they intended to share. What followed would shatter every belief propaganda had built. Oberkirchen had been a farming village of 400 souls before the war, nestled in the Bavarian hills, where wheat grew gold in summer and snow buried everything in winter. By May 1945, only 200 remained, mostly women, children, and men too old to have been conscripted. The young men were dead or scattered across a continent. The leadership had fled, and what remained was rubble and exhaustion and the terrible waiting for whatever came next. The women had gathered in the mayor's cellar 3 days before the surrender, when word came that American forces were approaching from the west. The propaganda had been explicit and terrifying. Americans would destroy everything, would show no mercy, would take revenge for the war that had consumed the world. The regime's final broadcasts had been apocalyptic, promising that occupation would mean annihilation. Frau Zimmermann, 47 years old, and the village schoolteacher before school stopped functioning, had organized the cellar refuge. She gathered women and children what food they could carry, blankets and water and medicine. They descended into darkness and waited, listening to artillery grow closer, feeling the earth shake with explosions, praying in whispers because even prayer felt dangerous. Among the women was Elizabeth Müller, 32, whose husband had been lost on the Eastern Front 2 years earlier. She held her 2 children close: Karl, age 7, and little Greta, only 4, and tried to project calm she didn't feel. The children were thin, had been thin for months, rationing and shortages, having stripped away the softness of childhood until bones showed sharp beneath pale skin. There was Hannah Becker, 26, 8 months pregnant, and terrified not just for herself, but for the child who would be born into this destroyed world. There was old Frau Weber, 73, who had lived through the previous war and now watched history repeat itself with eyes that had seen too much. There was young Sophie Krause, barely 19, who had believed every word the regime said and now faced the collapse of that belief with nowhere to hide. They waited in the cellar for 3 days after the surrender was announced on the radio. 3 days of darkness, broken only by candles that were running out. 3 days of rationing food that was already scarce. 3 days of children asking questions no one could answer. The Americans came on a Thursday afternoon, the 10th of May. The women heard vehicles first, the rumble of engines, the squeak of treads, sounds that meant military force arriving in overwhelming strength. Then came voices speaking English, a language most of them understood poorly if at all, words that seemed harsh and foreign to ears trained on German. Frau Zimmermann climbed the cellar stairs carefully, her heart hammering against her ribs. She emerged into the mayor's house, found it partially collapsed from nearby shelling, and stepped through the ruined doorway into afternoon light that hurt her eyes after 3 days of darkness. The village square was filled with American soldiers and vehicles. Tanks sat like enormous metal beasts at the intersections. Trucks were parked in rows. Men in olive uniforms moved with the casual confidence of victors, checking buildings, securing the area, establishing control. A soldier noticed Frau Zimmermann and approached. He was young, couldn't have been more than 22, with a face that hadn't quite lost the softness of boyhood. His uniform was dusty, his rifle slung over his shoulder with the ease of someone who had carried it for months. When he spoke, his voice was surprisingly gentle. "Ma'am, are there more people in there?" He gestured toward the cellar entrance. Frau Zimmermann understood enough English to catch the meaning. She nodded, her throat too tight for speech. "Tell them to come out," the soldier said. "It's safe. We're not here to hurt anyone." She descended back into the cellar, found 10 pairs of eyes watching her in the candlelight, waiting for news that would determine everything. "They say we should come up," she reported in German. "They say it's safe. You believe them?" Elizabeth asked, her arms still wrapped protectively around her children. "I don't know," Frau Zimmermann admitted, "but we can't stay down here forever." One by one, they climbed the stairs. The women went first, shielding the children behind them, emerging into daylight that felt too bright, too normal for a world that had just ended. They stood blinking in the square, facing American soldiers who studied them with expressions ranging from curiosity to pity to something harder to name. An officer approached Captain James Morrison, as they would later learn, 31 years old, from Illinois, a schoolteacher before the war, like Frau Zimmermann. He spoke in careful, slower English, while a German-speaking soldier translated. "We're here to secure the area and establish order. You won't be harmed if you follow instructions and cooperate. We need to know, are there weapons in the village? Are there any military personnel hiding?" The women shook their heads. There had been a few soldiers passing through days earlier, but they had fled west ahead of the American advance. The village had nothing left to defend itself with, nothing left to fight for, nothing left but survival. Morrison studied them, these 11 women and 7 children who looked like they hadn't eaten properly in months. He saw exhaustion and terror, and something else that bothered him, the expectation of cruelty, as if these people had been taught to expect the worst and were bracing for it. What struck Morrison most forcefully was the condition of the children. Carl Meller's arms were stick-thin. Little Greta's belly was distended in that way that signals malnutrition rather than fullness. The other children showed similar signs hunger made visible in small bodies that should have been plump with health. He turned to his sergeant, a man named Robert Chun, whose family had come from China to California before the war. "Get rations," Morrison ordered. "Rations, rations, whatever we've got. These people are starving." Chun hesitated. "Sir, regulations say we're not supposed to—" "I don't care what regulations say," Morrison interrupted. "Look at those kids. Get the rations. Now." Within minutes, soldiers began bringing boxes from their supply trucks. C-ration tins, K-ration boxes, D-ration chocolate bars, cans of Spam and corned beef and vegetables, crackers and coffee, and powdered milk. They stacked them in the square, while the German women watched with expressions moving from suspicion to confusion to something approaching disbelief. Morrison approached Frau Zimmermann, the translator at his side. "This is food for you and the children. We have plenty. You need it more than we do." Frau Zimmermann stared at him, certain she had misunderstood. The translator repeated the words in German. Still, she couldn't process what was being offered. The propaganda had been explicit. Americans would take everything, would let Germans starve, would show the cruelty that the regime had always warned about. "I don't understand," she said in halting English. "This is ... for us?" "Yes, ma'am. For you and the children. Free. No cost, no conditions." Elizabeth stepped forward, her voice sharp with suspicion born from years of propaganda. "Why? Why would you give us food? What do you want from us?" The translator rendered this in English, and Morrison's face softened with understanding. These women had been taught to expect the worst from their enemies. Kindness didn't fit into that framework, so they were searching for the trap, the hidden cost, the moment when generosity would reveal itself as something darker. "We don't want anything," Morrison said through the translator. "We're soldiers, but we're also human beings. Those children are hungry. We have food. It's as simple as that." But it wasn't simple. Nothing about this moment was simple. The women had spent years being told that Americans were soft and weak, that they lacked the strength and will that made the German regime superior. They had been promised that if Americans ever occupied Germany, the treatment would be harsh and vengeful. They had built their entire understanding of enemies around these teachings. Now those teachings confronted reality, and reality was American soldiers carrying boxes of food to starving children without asking for payment, or favors or anything, except that the food be eaten. The women didn't move toward the food. They stood frozen, trapped between hunger and suspicion, between need and training that said accepting help from enemies was surrender or weakness or dangerous. The children looked at their mothers, waiting for permission, bellies tight with hunger, but uncertain whether these strange soldiers and their offerings could be trusted. Morrison recognized the paralysis. He had seen it before in other liberated villages, this inability to accept kindness because kindness hadn't been part of the promised narrative. He opened a C-ration tin himself, used his P3 8-can opener with the practiced motion of someone who had done this hundreds of times, and held out the tin to little Greta. "It's beef stew," he said softly, the translator rendering his words. "It's good. You'll like it." Greta looked at her mother. Elizabeth's face showed the war raging inside her pride and pragmatism, suspicion and desperate hope, the trained responses of propaganda fighting against maternal instinct that recognized her children were starving. Finally, Elizabeth nodded. Just a small movement of her head, permission given with reluctance and fear. Greta stepped forward and took the tin with hands that trembled slightly. She looked at the brown contents, sniffed cautiously, then took a tentative bite with the spoon Morrison offered. Her eyes went wide. The food was warm, rich with flavor she had forgotten existed, and suddenly she was eating with the desperate intensity of someone who hasn't had enough food in far too long. Carl moved next, then the other children, each breaking through the barrier of suspicion to accept food from soldiers they had been taught were enemies. The women followed more slowly, their approach more cautious, but hunger and exhaustion ultimately proved stronger than propaganda. They sat in the village square, these 11 German women and 7 children eating American rations, while soldiers watched with expressions that mixed satisfaction with sadness. The satisfaction came from feeding hungry people. The sadness came from understanding how hungry they had been, from seeing evidence of years of deprivation, from recognizing that these civilians had suffered for a war they didn't start and couldn't stop. Elizabeth ate slowly, rationing her own hunger to watch her children eat their fill. She saw Carl's face as he tasted chocolate from a D-ration bar, saw the wonder and joy that seemed impossible given everything they had endured. She saw Greta eating with both hands, trying to consume as much as possible before it disappeared or was taken away. And Elizabeth wept, not quietly or discreetly, but with deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire frame. She cried for her children who had learned hunger as a normal state. She cried for her husband lost on the Eastern Front. She cried for the village destroyed around them. She cried for the lies she had believed and the truth she had refused to see. She cried because American soldiers' enemies, who were supposed to be cruel and vengeful, were feeding her starving children without asking anything in return. The other women began crying too. Frau Zimmermann sat on rubble and wept for the students she had taught who were now dead or scattered. Hannah Becker cried for the child she would soon bring into this destroyed world. Old Frau Weber cried for having lived long enough to see Germany destroy itself twice. Young Sophie cried because everything she had been taught was revealed as lies, and she didn't know what was true anymore. The American soldiers watched this mass breakdown with uncomfortable recognition. Some of them had liberated camps and seen horrors that would haunt them forever. They had watched people discover lost family members, had seen joy and grief tangled beyond separation. But there was something particularly profound about watching women cry while eating food that had been shared freely, watching the moment when propaganda met reality and shattered completely. Sergeant Shun approached Morrison quietly. "Sir, they're crying." "I know," Morrison said. Should we do something? We are doing something. We are feeding them. Let them process this however they need to. After the initial overwhelming emotion passed, after the children had eaten until their shrunken stomachs could hold no more, after the crying had settled into occasional tears rather than constant sobs, Frau Zimmermann approached Captain Morrison. She had composed herself, had wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders, had found within herself the teacher who had once commanded classrooms. "Why?" she asked in English that was better than she had initially let on. "I need to understand why you would do this." Morrison considered his answer carefully. "Because it's the right thing to do. Those children didn't start this war. They didn't make the decisions that led to all this destruction. They're just kids who are hungry, and we have food. But we are Germans. We are your enemies. We fought against you for 6 years. You're not my enemy," Morrison corrected gently. "The regime that started this war was the enemy. The leadership that made these choices was the enemy. But you're just a teacher trying to keep children alive. That doesn't make you my enemy. That makes you someone who deserves help." Frau Zimmermann struggled to process this distinction. The propaganda had taught that enemies were absolute, that there was no differentiation between leadership and people, that German civilians and German soldiers were part of a unified whole that deserved total loyalty or total opposition. "I was told," she said slowly, "that Americans would be cruel, that you would take revenge for the war. That occupation would be harsh and terrible. I imagine you were told a lot of things that weren't true," Morrison replied. "Yes," the admission hurt. "Yes, I think perhaps everything we were told was lies." Elizabeth joined the conversation, her English more halting, but her need to understand equally strong. "My husband died fighting your soldiers. How can you be kind to me after that?" Morrison's face showed the complexity of this question. "Your husband was fighting for something he believed in, or was ordered to fight for. My job was to stop him, and that meant fighting. But the war is over now. Your husband is gone, and I'm sorry for that, genuinely sorry, because war takes people who might have been friends in another life and makes them fight each other. But his death doesn't mean I should punish you or your children. They're innocent. They deserve better than to pay for decisions they never made." Over the following hours, as the afternoon stretched toward evening, the interaction between the American soldiers and the German women evolved from suspicious charity to something approaching genuine exchange. The soldiers shared more food, showed the women how to open the C ration tins with P38 openers, explained what each item was and how it should be prepared. They discovered that Sergeant Shun spoke some German learned from his grandfather. He became an additional translator, bridging gaps in understanding, helping facilitate conversations that moved beyond immediate needs to actual connection. The children, having eaten and feeling safe for the first time in weeks, began exploring the American vehicles with the universal curiosity of youth. Soldiers showed them jeeps and trucks, let them sit in driver's seats, gave them chewing gum and candy that the kids had never tasted before. Young Sophie Krause, who had believed most fervently in the regime's promises, sat with a young soldier named Private David Miller from Ohio. He showed her photographs of his family, his mother and father, his 3 sisters, his dog named Buddy. The ordinariness of it struck Sophie with force. This soldier had a family, a home, a life that was as real and valuable as her own. The propaganda had portrayed Americans as abstractions, as threats rather than people. But here was David Miller showing her pictures of his dog, talking about his sister's love of baseball, mentioning his mother's cooking in tones of homesick affection. "I thought you would be different," Sophie said in broken English. "Different how?" Miller asked. "Bad, mean. The propaganda said Americans were ... She struggled for words. "Said you were not good people." "Propaganda lies," Miller said simply. "Every country's propaganda lies. Makes the enemies seem worse than they are, so people will keep fighting. But look around. Do we seem like monsters to you? Sophie looked at the soldiers sharing food with starving children, at Captain Morrison, talking gently with Frau Zimmermann, at Sergeant Chun helping Hannah Becker open a can of peaches with the careful attention of someone who recognized pregnant women needed extra care. "No," she admitted. "No, you seem like people." "Just people. That's all any of us are," Miller replied. "Just people caught up in something too big to fully understand, trying to do the right thing in the middle of chaos." As evening approached, Morrison noticed that Hannah Becker was moving with obvious discomfort, her advanced pregnancy making every motion labored. He called over the unit's medic, Corporal Thomas Walsh, who had been a medical student before being drafted. Walsh examined Hannah carefully, his touch professional but gentle, and spoke through Sergeant Chun's translation. "She's going to have this baby soon, maybe within the week. She's malnourished, probably anemic, and she shouldn't be living in a cellar when she goes into labor." Morrison made a decision that would have been questioned by some commanders, but felt obvious to him. Clear out the mayor's house as best you can. Make it livable. Mrs. Becker will stay there, and any of the other women and children who need shelter. Post guards to make sure no one bothers them. The soldiers worked through the evening, clearing rubble, patching holes in the roof, making the damaged house as secure as possible. They brought in cots and blankets from supply trucks, set up a wood stove for heat, created something approaching livable quarters. Hannah watched this with tears streaming down her face again. She was 8 months pregnant in a country that had been destroyed, her husband lost in the war, her future uncertain. She had expected to give birth in a cellar or worse. Instead, American soldiers were building her a refuge, or making sure she would have shelter when her child came. Frau Weber, the old woman who had survived 2 wars, sat beside Hannah and spoke in a voice that carried decades of hard-earned wisdom. "I have seen much cruelty in my long life, but I have also seen kindness survive in the most unlikely places. These Americans are teaching us something important, that humanity can persist even when everything else fails." The women and children slept in the mayor's house that night, the first real sleep many of them had experienced in weeks. American soldiers stood guard outside, keeping watch not to imprison but to protect. Inside, children curled up with full bellies for the first time in months. Women lay on cots and processed the day's impossible revelations. Elizabeth held her sleeping children and thought about her husband. She wondered if he had encountered kindness from enemies, or if his final moments had been harsh and violent. She wondered what he would think about American soldiers feeding his children, about the fact that enemies had shown more practical compassion in one afternoon than the regime had shown in years. Sophie lay awake thinking about the photographs. David Miller had shown her his ordinary American family living ordinary lives. The regime had taught her that Americans were fundamentally different, morally inferior, weak in ways that made them deserving of conquest. But the evidence of her own eyes contradicted every lesson. These Americans possessed strength, but they used it for protection rather than domination. They possessed abundance, but they shared it rather than hoarding it. Frau Zimmermann wrote in her diary by candlelight, documenting the day with the teacher's attention to detail and accuracy. She wrote about the fear in the cellar, the shocking appearance of soldiers with boxes of food, the children eating, the women crying, the realization that everything they had been taught was lies. She ended her entry with a question. If they lied about this, what else was lies? How much of what we believed was propaganda rather than truth? The Americans remained in Oberkirchen for the next week, establishing a temporary headquarters while they organized the occupation of the surrounding region. Captain Morrison made it a point to check on the German women and children daily, ensuring they had adequate food and that Hannah Becker received proper prenatal care from Corporal Walsh. More rations flowed freely. The soldiers shared not just food, but medicine, soap, blankets, and other supplies that had become precious luxuries during the war's final months. They brought chocolate for the children, coffee for the adults, cigarettes for those who smoked. These were unofficial distributions through military channels, but personal gestures from individuals who saw suffering and possessed the means to alleviate it. The relationship between occupiers and occupied became something unexpected. The women taught soldiers German phrases. The soldiers taught the children English words. Young Sophie found herself having long conversations with David Miller about the war, about propaganda, about how people on both sides had been manipulated by their governments. "I believed everything they told me," Sophie confessed one afternoon while helping Miller sort supply boxes. About German superiority, about American weakness, about the righteousness of the war. "I believed it all." "Most people believe what they're taught," Miller replied without judgment, "especially when questioning those teachings is dangerous or impossible. You were raised in a system designed to make you believe. That's not your fault. But I should have questioned more. Should have been brave enough to see through the lies? Maybe. But you're questioning now. You're learning now. That counts for something." 6 days after the Americans arrived, Hannah Becker went into labor. It happened in the early morning hours, and Corporal Walsh was woken to assist. He found Hannah in the mayor's house, breathing through contractions, surrounded by the other women who were helping as much as they could. Walsh had assisted with deliveries during his medical training, though not many. He worked methodically, monitoring Hannah's progress, keeping her as comfortable as possible with the limited resources available. Frau Zimmermann boiled water. Elizabeth gathered clean cloth for bandages. Old Frau Weber offered the kind of calm, experienced presence that only age provides. The labor was long and difficult. Hannah's malnutrition made everything harder, her body depleted from months of inadequate food. But she was young and determined, and she had something to fight for: a child who would be born free from the regime shadow, who would grow up in whatever Germany emerged from the ruins. At 3 p.m, with Captain Morrison and several soldiers anxiously waiting outside, a baby girl entered the world with a cry that seemed impossibly loud for something so small. Walsh cleaned her, wrapped her in a blanket one of the soldiers donated, and placed her in Hannah's arms. "She's healthy," Walsh said through Sergeant Chun's translation. "Small but healthy. She's a fighter." Hannah looked at her daughter, this tiny, perfect person born into chaos, and felt emotions too complex to name. Joy and terror, hope and grief, love and uncertainty, all tangled together. She had brought life into a destroyed world, but she had also brought hope, evidence that life continued despite everything. Morrison entered the room after being told it was safe. He looked at the new mother and child with an expression that mixed professional satisfaction with personal emotion. "Congratulations, Mrs. Becker. She's beautiful." "Thank you," Hannah said in careful English. "Thank you for everything. For the food, for the shelter, for the medical care. Thank you for letting my daughter be born in a bed rather than a cellar." "You don't need to thank me for basic decency," Morrison replied gently. "That's just being human." But Hannah shook her head. "No, this is more than basic decency. You didn't have to do any of this. You could have followed regulations, could have kept us at distance, could have done the minimum required. Instead, you chose kindness. That matters. My daughter will grow up knowing that American soldiers helped bring her into the world, that enemies chose to be something else." 2 days after the birth, Hannah approached Captain Morrison with a request that surprised him. She wanted to name her daughter in honor of the Americans who had helped her survive. In German tradition, children often carried multiple names, and she wanted to give her daughter an American name alongside the German ones. "I want to call her Grace," Hannah explained through Sergeant Chun, "because that is what you showed us, grace we didn't deserve, but received anyway. Grace Elizabeth Becker. The Elizabeth for my mother, but the grace for what you taught me." Morrison felt his throat tighten. He was a soldier, had been trained to maintain professional distance, to see military objectives rather than individual stories. But there was something about this moment, a German woman naming her newborn daughter after the concept American soldiers had demonstrated, that cut through all his training and reached something fundamental. "That's a beautiful name," he managed to say. "An honor I'm not sure we've earned." "You earned it by treating us like human beings," Hannah replied. "By feeding starving children. By making sure my baby was born safely. You earned it every day you've been here." 10 days after arriving in Oberkirchen, Morrison received orders to move his unit west toward Frankfurt, where American forces were consolidating and establishing more permanent occupation structures. The time had come to leave these women and children, to move on to the next objective, to continue the work of managing post-war Germany. The departure was harder than Morrison expected. He had tried to maintain professional distance, had reminded himself repeatedly that these were just civilians in one small village among thousands, that his kindness was simply following the best principles of humanity rather than creating personal bonds. But bonds had formed anyway. He had watched Karl Muller gain weight and energy, had seen little Greta smile for the first time, had witnessed Grace's birth and Hannah's overwhelming gratitude. He had talked with Frau Zimmermann about education and literature, had listened to Elizabeth's stories about her lost husband, had observed young Sophie's transformation from true believer to questioning skeptic. The women gathered in the village square for the soldiers' departure, and this time the tears were different. Not tears of overwhelming emotion and unexpected kindness, but tears of genuine grief at friends leaving. "What happens to us now?" Elizabeth asked, holding her children close. "Other American units will come through," Morrison explained. "Eventually, there will be a more permanent occupation structure, organizations to help with rebuilding, food distribution systems, all of it. You'll be taken care of, but it won't be you," Sophie said quietly. "No, but the soldiers who come after us will continue what we started. The United States isn't here to punish German civilians. We're here to help rebuild, to establish democracy, to make sure this never happens again." Frau Zimmermann presented Morrison with a gift, a hand-sewn American flag she had created using scraps of cloth, the stars and stripes carefully rendered despite her limited materials. "So you remember us," she said. "So you remember that your kindness mattered, that it changed lives, that it taught us what we needed to learn." Morrison accepted the flag with hands that trembled slightly. "I won't forget. None of us will." The story of what happened in Oberkirchen spread through the American military and through the German civilian population in ways Morrison never anticipated. Other soldiers heard about the unit that fed starving civilians with their own rations, about the captain who established shelter for pregnant women, about the men who helped deliver a baby and were honored in that baby's name. Some criticized Morrison for being too soft, for prioritizing civilians or military objectives, for creating unrealistic expectations about how occupation would proceed. But most recognized what he had done, demonstrated that Americans could be victors without being cruel, could occupy without dominating, could show strength through mercy rather than just through force. For the German civilians who experienced or heard about what happened in Oberkirchen, the impact was profound and lasting. The story became a kind of parable, evidence that not all enemies were cruel, that propaganda had lied about fundamental things, that the world could work differently than the regime had promised. Elizabeth Muller wrote to her husband's family, describing what had happened, how American soldiers had fed her starving children, had shown her kindness when she expected cruelty, had treated her with dignity when she had been prepared for degradation. The letter became treasured family history, passed down through generations as evidence that humanity could survive even war. Young Sophie Krauss became a teacher like Frau Zimmermann, dedicating her life to educating young Germans about the importance of questioning authority, recognizing propaganda, thinking critically rather than accepting what they were told. She always began her courses by telling the story of Oberkirchen, of American soldiers sharing their rations, of the moment when everything she believed was revealed as lies. Hannah Becker raised Grace with stories about her birth, how she came into the world, not just with German hands helping, but with American medical care, American supplies, American soldiers ensuring both mother and child survived. Grace grew up understanding that enemies were not absolute categories, but humans who could choose differently, that nationality mattered less than character, that the Americans who helped bring her into the world had taught her mother the most important lesson of all, that kindness was not weakness, but the highest form of strength. Historians who later studied the American occupation of Germany noted that the first days and weeks after the war's end were crucial in shaping German civilian attitudes toward their occupiers. Acts of cruelty created resentment that festered for generations. But acts of kindness, like soldiers sharing their rations with starving civilians, created goodwill that facilitated reconstruction and reconciliation. The Marshall Plan would eventually bring massive aid to rebuild Germany. Democratic institutions would be established. The country would be divided and eventually reunified. But beneath all those large historical movements were thousands of small moments, like the one in Oberkirchen individual, soldiers choosing to see civilians as humans rather than enemies, making personal decisions to share what they had, demonstrating through their actions that a different kind of occupation was possible. Captain Morrison returned to Illinois after the war, resumed his teaching career, and rarely spoke about his military service. But he kept Frau Zimmermann's handmade flag in his study, and when his own children asked about the war, he told them about Oberkirchen. He told them about 11 women and 7 children hiding in a cellar, about the moment when suspicion gave way to gratitude, about a baby named Grace, born into kindness rather than cruelty. "I didn't do anything extraordinary," he would say. "I just treated people the way I would want to be treated if our positions were reversed. That's not heroism. That's just basic human decency." But his children understood, as did his students when he told the story in later years, that basic human decency was exactly what made the difference. In a world that had been destroyed by 6 years of total war, by ideologies that reduced people to categories of worthy and unworthy, by systems that demanded cruelty as proof of strength, in that world basic human decency was revolutionary. The women of Oberkirchen could not believe. American soldiers shared their rations because they had been taught not to believe it was possible. The propaganda had been clear and consistent. Enemies were cruel, occupation would be harsh, defeat would mean suffering. The entire system they had lived under was built on the assumption that power meant domination, that strength required cruelty, that victory gave the right to punish. When American soldiers appeared with boxes of food instead of weapons demanding surrender, when they gave freely instead of taking, when they showed concern for children's health instead of indifference to civilian suffering, it wasn't just surprising. It was a reality directly contradicting propaganda in ways too fundamental to ignore. The crying that followed wasn't just relief at being fed, though hunger certainly played a role. It was the sound of worldviews shattering, of carefully constructed beliefs collapsing under the weight of evidence, of people recognizing they had been lied to about fundamental things. If Americans weren't cruel victors, what else had been lies? If enemies could show kindness, what did that say about the regime's teachings on superiority and conquest? The rations themselves were unremarkable standard military supplies, nothing special or luxurious. But the act of sharing them was profound. It demonstrated that Americans possessed abundance, but chose sharing over hoarding, that they saw German civilians as humans deserving compassion rather than enemies deserving punishment, that their strength included the ability to be merciful. For the women and children of Oberkirchen, that May afternoon became a turning point. They would carry the memory of it through the difficult years of Reconstruction, through the slow rebuilding of a democratic Germany, through decades of peace that followed war. They would tell their children and grandchildren about the day American soldiers fed them, about the moment when propaganda met reality and shattered completely. And in that telling, they would pass forward the crucial lesson. That humanity persists even in war's worst moments, that people can choose kindness even when cruelty would be easier. That enemies are not absolutes, but possibilities that can be transformed through basic human decency. The women of Oberkirchen couldn't believe American soldiers would share their rations, but they did. And in that simple act of sharing food with hungry children, those soldiers planted seeds of understanding that would grow into forests of reconciliation, teaching through their actions what no amount of propaganda or education could have conveyed, that the path forward from war wasn't through continued hatred, but through the revolutionary act of choosing to see each other as humanity despite everything that had happened.